We're here in Grand Isle, Louisiana, which is a very lovely place. Today I got way too up close and not at all personal with some big blobs of oil out in Caminada Bay. That was vile in the bay. But when Tulane professor Mike Blum and I got to a nearby island that had been soaked in oil, I unlearned my previous definition of the word vile because I found it just needed updating. All right, so we're at the mouth of Barataria Bay.
Exactly.
And obviously, there's a lot of oil. You have the same sort of globs that we saw out in the sea on the way over, out in the bay on the way over here. This is what they look like on land. This is my favorite pen. Not anymore. What I want to know is, once oil does make landfall like this, what happens? Does oil move in marshland in a way that we don't really understand?
Well, what we understand now is when oil gets deposited by wave action, like we're seeing right now, it accumulates, it goes right to the soil, and it coats the soil. So you don't get gas exchange, you get basically an anoxic layer where nothing can breathe.
Meaning no blocking oxygen.
No oxygen.
So this obviously not very substantial small island that we're on, with oil coating it, becomes less substantial, more subject to erosion. This island's in danger of going away because this oil is on it.
Exactly. So with oil coating surfaces of the soil and plants, if it is sufficient enough like it is right now, you can see it kills plants right where it comes into contact. And by just suffocating the plants, you lose the anchor that the plants provide, and you get rapid erosion of these islands. And these are the islands that endangered species or imperiled species like the brown pelican use as roosts and rookeries.
So, Mike, even to get here, we had to go past this sort of line of absorbent boom here, and some of it is clearly stopping some oil. I mean, it's obviously soiled, and it's playing some role, but we didn't drive over boom to get here. There's obviously a big break in it, and this stuff is not set up in a way that looks like it could be effective. Booming isn't worthless. It's just being done in a worthless way, right?
Right. So the way that boom is being implemented, it's not being effective. It's not as efficient as the technology could provide. What we need are more people out in the ground implementing and maintaining the boom in place. And there's certainly thousands of people potentially available to implement boom effectively. If they were trained and if they were deployed well, then we would have much more protection than what we have right now.
So, big picture, as research and development in the oil industry have been devoted almost solely in the big picture toward drilling, toward more production, and not toward mitigation and cleanup efforts. Mitigation and cleanup technology has stayed the same. It's not pointless, but it does require a lot of manpower and a lot of attention.
That's right.
And whatever manpower is being devoted right now to the Gulf region, it's clearly not enough to get the booming right.
No. So booming, again, is a first line of defense. It could actually provide a second and a third line of defense if implemented well. One thing that is really worthwhile to point out is that there are thousands of people calling in to BP indicating that there are technologies under development and potentially available for implementation. The problem is that it takes years to evaluate effectiveness, and so we have a history of booming. We know how it works. We know potentially how to implement it. These alternative technologies that could potentially be put in place, there hasn't been testing, there hasn't been any sort of evaluation process. So even though you may have the best solution available, you have to go through proper channels. You have to go through a timeline to indicate that that technology is worthwhile for further investment.
And that most of the technology, most of the resources, most of the research done toward cleanup and containment tech happened in the late 70s,
Exactly.
80s. It hasn't been the focus since then.
Exactly.
They've been too busy counting their money.
Well, so the investments that could be made by BP and other petroleum organizations for technologies like boom or alternative technologies, if you think about it in terms of product development, the timelines for product development can stretch from years to decades.
Yeah.
And we certainly have had the time. We have had plenty of lessons learned since the late 1970s when Ixtoc 1 exploded. That's a good indication that there is a need, but from a commercial perspective, there hasn't been that drive or that investment for implementation.
So thinking about research that hasn't been done, technology that hasn't been tested, better ideas that haven't been pursued, there's this whole issue of dispersant. And essentially the argument was, well, we know dispersant's toxic, but better to put toxic dispersant on the oil so as to avoid concentrated clumps of oil coming up on shore. The dispersant might make that less prevalent, and so therefore it's a lesser of two evils. What do you think about that?
So when dispersant was applied offshore, we clearly didn't know what the consequences were. It hadn't been actually experimented on. The conditions were unknown. And what we know now, even from the little research that's been done on this, if you have a comparison, if you have alternatives of no oil, obviously the best, oil or dispersed oil actually has the potential for being more toxic and having a much more dramatic impact on shoreline conditions, on marshes, than just oil by itself. It's amazingly concentrated. You'd think that just by washing it off, it would come off, but and really, a dispersant is just a fancy soap.
So the dispersant makes the oil worse?
Potentially.
For dealing with it ecologically.
Exactly. So if you think about it, these clumps, there's certainly something that potentially is more manageable. You can see that they have the potential for being naturally broken down by tidal flux and by just physical action.
Yeah.
Dispersed oil creates a sheen that penetrates the soil, and again, it removes the potential for oxygen exchange. And so you're talking about a situation in which you can't even really see what's going on, but more or less there's no oxygen, and without oxygen, you lose plants, you lose animals, you lose fish. Everything that you want to sustain in a marsh is going to be potentially taken away.
Congressman for this endangered and beautiful area of Louisiana is Charlie Melanson. He joins us next as our coverage of the BP oil disaster continues, now with 100% more rage. I also want to show you this. This is a live look at the well from BP. We've been watching this all day, of course, as have many people online. It's the effort by BP to try to get the cap onto the well at the Deepwater Horizon site. You can see there's plenty of oil there, but you can also see that cap as they're trying to fit it down over that still gushing well. We'll be right back.